And there is a lot happening here, Sophie, as I bring you in, and Dr. Ranesh, as we process some of the conversations here. There are issues that are at the heart of, some of the countries. And it's no surprise, Dr. Ranesh, that the president of Turkey is going to speak about the issues of the Middle East because it's something that he has been extremely involved in, extremely supportive of the case of South Africa at the ICJ, extremely involved in what was going on the ground there as well.
No, absolutely, Bongiwe. While listening to the Turkish president, certain phrases and certain words actually stood out for me. The first one was South Africa's principled support, South Africa's principled stance on the Palestine issue. Then words such as commend, humanity, courageous, and salute them. Gaza is all our responsibility. And I think what really matters for me nowadays, Bongiwe, is that there is a certain, narrative going around now. This is 2025. The Israel-Palestine conflict has been going on for multiple decades. So now we're no longer talking about the Camp David Accords. We're no longer talking about the 1993 Oslo Accords. We're talking about the pre-1967 borders when we need to resolve the Palestine-Israel issue. So now we are, pushing that narrative. And I think the world has grown so fed up of this issue. We saw what happened in Gaza for the past 2 years. South Africa receiving wide praise from various quarters, especially the president of Turkey, praising South Africa's principled stance. So I think this issue is still going to be seized with us. We saw what happened. Israel again breached the ceasefire. Yesterday, I think it was close to 30 people that were killed in fresh airstrikes. We saw attacks in Lebanon, fresh attacks in Syria as well. So this kind of reminds me back to South Africa and the apartheid days. Remember, we had the frontline states, and the frontline states were attacked by the South African apartheid government. So it seems like the very same playbook is still being applied in the Middle East. Israel trying to defend itself. It says it's self-defense, and it's trying to weaken all its neighbors, like apartheid South Africa tried to do with all the surrounding countries, on the borders of South Africa. We're talking about Eswatini, we're talking about Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe to a certain extent. So I think that narrative, now is going to move 10 steps forward after this G20 summit. And I think, world opinion has changed. The last time I checked, there is a possibility that the ICJ judgment, the genocide case, there is probably going to be a judgment towards the middle of next year. But I think justice flows a little too slow. It takes too long to resolve these issues. Thus far, we've seen around 69,000 Palestinians killed. Okay, fine. Most of the, Israel's always saying, Israel and the US is always arguing that of that 69,000, 20,000 were terrorists or so-called Hamas terrorists. But remember, most of those killed, of that 69,000, it's mainly women and children. And in today's modern world, that cannot be acceptable. Really, it cannot. It really cannot.
And Sophie, maybe you can also add some comments there, particularly around the fact that he's also supporting South Africa in the ICJ case, but he's also not the only world leader we are seeing post this G20 presidency that has sung praises for how South Africa held this G20 presidency with dignity too, and also just taking that diplomacy to another level.
South Africa post-1994 has been known as a country with high moral ground. And the president of Turkey there emphasizing that you are continuing with that. Why we are talking about South Africa that is supposed to always take a high moral ground? It is because the South African foreign policy is anchored around issues that are related to peace and security. Now, when you look at the theme of the summit, international solidarity was captured. He is saying the summit, you captured the international solidarity, continue to mobilize the world as it relates to solidarity with the Palestinians, because the international community contributed to the liberation of South Africa as it relates to international solidarity. We are saying the former president of the ANC, O.R. Tambo, mobilized the international community to support the struggle in the country. The ANC at that time took a conscious decision that he should leave the country and go and mobilize outside, and he did just that. So this time around, it is Palestine. He is saying we must do the same. And you know, South Africa took a flag for its ICJ case. But little is said about countries that have now filed their own documents to support South Africa before this case is being heard by the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. What was surprising is when the United Nations was formed, there was a clear conscious decision that you must have agencies and structures that will ensure that the UN is able to address the challenges of the world. The World Court, the International Criminal Court, deals with such matters when countries are aggrieved. You take your matter to the International Court of Justice so that the court can mediate. It is part of international law as it's being espoused with the principle of the UN. But when South Africa did that, it was attacked. South Africa didn't give Palestinians arms. South Africa said, let's use peaceful means. There are processes and structures to do that. Even though now you also have another parallel process because South Africa started at the International Criminal Court because you want individuals to take accountability. But the ICJ, International Court of Justice, that's part of the UN processes. So he's reminding the world that stop attacking South Africa. It's using peaceful means.
And Doc, when you speak about the UN, right, a lot of focus has also gone into that body as well because you have the UN Security Council, for example, where a number of countries, South Africa included, have called for its reform over time to say you do need a permanent member from the African countries, but also at the same time, you can't have so much power concentrated on one side because that also means the issues of the world are not being addressed evenly.
No, 100% fully agree with you, Bongiwe. And I think for the past 2 days, I've been emphasizing the point that, you know, we're sitting in 2025. The world has changed when the UN was first created in 1945. Around that time, most of Asia, Latin America, and most of Africa was colonized. And those countries just freed themselves from the colonial chains of oppression in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. When the UN was formed, there were around 50 countries, just 50. Now we're sitting with 193 member states of the UNGA, the United Nations General Assembly. If you look at the composition of the UN Security Council as well, just 5 permanent members, and they hold that, you know, that damaging veto power. And we are seeing what's happening in that Security Council votes, you know, especially with Israel and the US, because Israel is such a close ally of the US. You know, there is this purported, you know, shielding of Israel by the US and Israel's being allowed to get away with daylight murder, so to speak. So I think those things need urgent attention. And I think the Johannesburg Declaration from this G20 Summit actually spoke to that as well. The UN Secretary General at his press briefing on Friday, I think it was, he also addressed this matter. Reform has to happen. Africa is a nation of 55 countries, very diverse, very different. Their voice needs to be heard, regardless of whether they given a seat on the Security Council. They need to be given those powers equal to all those other members as well. I think it was recently, 2 years back, the US ambassador even suggested you know, on behalf of the US, we are not close to the idea of expanding the Security Council, but those new members who are going to join the Security Council will not be afforded a veto vote. Now, who is the US to dictate to the UN? That is my question. That has to change. It absolutely has to change. That is why I am so proud of our president. President Cyril Ramaphosa, I am so proud he stood his ground no matter how many attacks on social media. We had the Foreign Secretary of the US, Marco Rubio, launched scathing attacks against South Africa, against our country. You know, different government officials, you know, they following a different route of diplomacy. They doing social media diplomacy, and we are asking, you know what? Go through the proper channels. That's how diplomacy is conducted.
Yeah.
So I think the UN, there needs to be a lot of introspection. That introspection has to come from within, because the world of 1945, when the UN was created, those financial architecture institutions were created, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, it doesn't work. It doesn't work in modern day, the way the globe is structured today. That is my concern.
I want to take the point that you made there in terms of, being proud of South Africa for standing its ground. And I think, we are an hour before we close our broadcast here at the SABC. I think I want to take a moment and just change gears just slightly, Sophie. We'll start with you and maybe just go through the panel here. In terms of just your observations in terms of how South Africa has really treated just these geopolitical problems and has now turned it into almost like a congratulatory moment for the country, but also bearing in mind that the African vision has always been top of mind in terms of its priorities. But what should we take stock of? Notwithstanding, of course, the hard work that still needs to come, Sophie. I mean, it's not lost on me that this is only the beginning for African countries to seize the moment. But we have to take a moment, really, to just take stock of how well South Africa has run this.
Well, I think, to be honest, we are used to this, perhaps because when you had powerful conferences in South Africa post-1994, the means of communication and technology, you wouldn't be able to get news in a comprehensive form on the satellite TV, on the digital platform. Now the world is broad. People can hear, can see, can talk. But you will recall, in 2000, South Africa hosted the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Sandton at Wanderers, the people's-driven event like the social gathering this time around. We remember very well when President Robert Mugabe at that time took Tony Blair to task. Blair, keep your England, I will keep my Zimbabwe. South Africa was hosting a UN conference, and there were many heads of state and government compared to what we saw today here. And South Africa was able to deliver. Then 2003 in Durban, a UN conference, many leaders converged. Racism conference, fighting all forms of intolerance. The United States of America and Israel boycotting because they didn't want the text, the way it was written, or the declaration. The then president spending sleepless nights with Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma to ensure that there's a text of the summit when the two countries were trying to push for the collapse of the conference. And when the text was adopted, when the declaration was adopted, the singing you heard here on the floor by people who are working here, service providers, ordinary South Africans saying, we've done it. The same singing erupted early hours of the morning, and then Beki took a flight straight to Port Elizabeth to bury his father. South Africa has been a master in terms of difficult times at global stage. You go further, the launch of the African Union. When the African Union was launched in Durban, there were African countries who were trying to derail the launch because they didn't want to change from Organization of African Unity to the AU because they wouldn't let it go. Gaddafi was very problematic, paying countries to resist. But South Africa was there to steer the ship. And we saw the transformation of the Organization of African Unity to the AU that we have today. And South Africa navigating those difficult terrains. So South Africa is used to these kinds of challenges, and we have the capacity, the skills, the institutional memory in all sectors. And South Africans, when South Africa is under pressure, the country and the flag, they rally behind the country and the flag and the office, not the individual.
And in fact, Dr. Ronesh, before you give us your comments, because I think it's important. I mean, notwithstanding, like I said, Bongiwe, those critical points that have been raised at this G20 presidency, those key issues that have really been a thread from Indonesia right to South Africa.